Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of the Voigtlander Nokton 50mm F1 lens. Now, obviously, this is the most extreme instrument that they make at this point, largest maximum aperture. They have some f1.2 lenses, but this 50mm F1 lens is the largest maximum aperture available. And as the most extreme instrument, it's also the most expensive of their lens, clocking in at around $1,899 for this Sony E-mount version. Now, they do have a 50mm F1 lens for Canon RF and for Nikon Z. However, I don't think that this lens is identical to these. This is a new release. It's a little bit more expensive than those other lenses and has a few extra features here as well that we'll dive into, including the fact that it's the first Voigtlander lens that I've ever tested that does give you an option to declick the aperture, which of course is very welcome. So, is this lens worth the pretty substantial price premium over their 50mm f1.2 options? Well, at the end of the day, that's going to come down to a decision for yourself, but we're going to do our best to explore the pros and cons of this particular lens in our review here today. We'll start by taking a look at the features, the build, and the handling here. If you're not familiar with Voigtlander lenses, they are manual focus only lenses, though like a luxury or premium version that has the full suite of electronics. So they're handled a little bit differently than a lot of the more inexpensive manual focus lenses you might be familiar from other less premium brands. And so because there is electronic contacts, it means that it will communicate all the appropriate things to the camera. So your XF data, information for image stabilization, all of those things are going to be properly communicated to the camera. Here on Sony, if you start to zoom or start to hit the manual focus ring, it will automatically magnify the affected focus area, all of those type things that you might be accustomed to with an autofocus lens, save that both the aperture and the focus is going to be controlled through manual focus or manual aperture rings here. In many ways, I think of Voigtlander lenses as being an analog for Zeiss lenses. And now that Zeiss doesn't seem to be in this particular space any longer, focusing more on cine lenses, then it really has created this void that I think has been filled by Voigtlander at this point. So a luxury manual focus lens, though, in many cases, far more inexpensive than Zeiss lenses, though it's hard to argue the same for this particular lens. The other similarity to Zeiss comes to the optical glass, which we'll get to in just a moment, but the optical glass here is beautiful, and I think in many ways it is the same as what we find in Zeiss lenses, similar kind of look, which I happen to be really fond of. So let's talk about the overall functionality here. The manual focus ring and the overall look of the lens is a little bit different than any Voigtlander lens I've tested before. They traditionally have a particular look, and the rings will have this kind of ribbed, scalloped type look that has been pretty consistent. But instead here we have a little bit more contemporary look with a diamond pattern here that's similar to Canon RF lenses control ring. I actually like the look, I like the feel of the rings here, and functionality seems to be very good. Voigtlander really knows how to do manual focus rings, and once again we have a perfectly damped, buttery smooth manual focus experience, about 180 degrees of focus throw, which in my opinion is just about right. This is not an internally focusing lens, and so the lens barrel will extend about 13 millimeters when it is focused all the way towards minimum focus. It's actually fully retracted when focused to infinity, and as you focus towards the minimum focus, the lens actually extends in length. Maybe a kind of a mental backwards is what you might think. It has all of the distance scale markings here and etched into the lens barrel in both meters and feet, so metric and imperial. The metric is in white, the imperial is in red, and so easy to see on there. We have an aperture ring towards the front, which is very slim, but it has two options here. You can either have detents, clicks at every third aperture point, all the way from f1 all the way through to f16. But then you also have something unique here in that there is two kind of extended sections on either side that will allow you to pull that back towards you kind of in a clutch action. Then you've got to rotate it 180 degrees. You will now be in the clickless mode, and so that you can smoothly rack through all of the aperture options. The action for changing this takes a little bit of practice, and it's a little more clunky than what I would like. It's obviously much more involved than just flipping a switch. And the other thing I noted is it's nearly impossible to rotate that into either the click or declick position without also rotating the aperture ring. So be prepared to reset to whatever aperture value you wanted to previously. But at the same time, I'm really thrilled to have this new aperture option. Just helps the lens to be a little more effective for video work. Now inside the aperture iris itself, we have a high blade count of 12. Voigtlander uses straight rather than curved blades, so there's a little bit of give and take when it comes to that. In my opinion, more take. I prefer rounded blades unless it's a lens that really is about emphasizing stun stars, which that's not really true here. So what that does mean is that when you stop down a bit, you may see a bit of that aperture shape if you have bright specular highlights. So the high blade count does at least make it seem a little bit more round rather than a more definite shape. The lens size is 79.3 millimeters or 3.12 inches in diameter. It's a fairly chunky lens, and then its length is fairly short. It's only 69.3 millimeters or 2.73 inches in length. Because it's all metal and glass and beautifully made, by the way, it weighs in at 590 grams or 20.8 ounces. So the weight is a little heftier than what the lens size suggests, but it has that really high quality feel, much like a Zeiss lens, to where it feels like a beautifully made substantial lens, but it's not onerously heavy either. You know, under 600 grams means that it's, you know, it's not terribly heavy. Up front, we have very common 67 millimeter front filter threads in metal. The included lens hood is fairly slim, as you can see here, and it is not bayonet on, it threads on. Redundant filter threads inside here. So you can still use filters, and the lens hood does flare out a bit, and so you can still get in there to rotate a circular polarizing filter if you so desire. And by the way, because this lens has such a bright maximum aperture, it's probably going to be situations where you're going to want to use a filter on there, an ND filter, to allow you more flexibility of shooting at a bright aperture in brighter light. There is no weather sealing, so at the back of the lens outside of the electronic contacts, there's no weather sealing gasket or anything like that, so just something to be aware of. Minimum focus distance is 45 centimeters, and so that is only about average for a 50 millimeter lens, and actually at 58 degrees, it's a little bit wider angle of view than a lot of 50 millimeter lenses. Byproduct is that you get just a little bit lower maximum magnification. I would say average is about 0.15. I would estimate that it's about 0.13 times magnification. So not, you know, you can't get super close to things, so you can still obviously really strongly blur out backgrounds because that maximum aperture is so huge. Manual focus, as far as handling, you know, manual focus is not for everyone, but this lens really is a treat to use. Let's talk about how it works on Sony here. I will say as a negative, just using a manual focus on a Sony body, sometimes Sony's viewfinders get a little bit squirrely, and that's true particularly on my A7R5. My Alpha 1 here is a little bit better in that regard, but at the same time, having an EVF for doing manual focus is great. You can have focus overlays in the viewfinder or on screen. You can magnify the image there. It makes manual focus really quite simple. I also found that in-body image stabilization worked fine with the lens. It communicated properly. So I got good stable results either on my Alpha 1 and even more so on my A7R Mark V, which has a little bit better image stabilization. The implementation of the manual focus aids works well here. I do like both Canon RF and Nikon Z have some additional kind of on-screen that allows you to see when you've achieved proper focus. Sony doesn't have kind of the equivalent of that focus guide on Canon, for example, but I also find that the auto magnification works really well. It's very well implemented on Sony, and so thus it's very easy to visually confirm focus and nail it. I had very, very high focus accuracy in my review period. Even when shooting at f1, I could focus on this blade of grass, for example, and single it out without any kind of issue. I will also note that the video focus pulls are really lovely. It's a beautifully damped focus ring, and so that is also a joy to use. Finally, I'll give you an optical overview here, and there'll be a detailed optical breakdown at the end of the video itself. Optical formula here is 9 elements in 7 groups. That includes an aspherical element, a grinding aspherical element, a couple of exotics there. It has a dual personality, a lot like most Nokton lenses in my experience, which means that at very wide apertures, it's a little bit dreamy. There's a little bit of blooming. It's a particular look that either you like or you dislike, but it is a look. And then as you stop the lens down, contrast really starts to increase. It becomes razor sharp at smaller apertures. Like most Voigtlander lenses, there's something really special about the look of images. And I think that Voigtlander is a great option. If you're a person that doesn't like to post-process images, you want to be able to just take images you love right in camera, a Voigtlander glass is special in that regard. There's a unique blend, much like Zeiss, of the color, the bokeh, and the vignette that gives a really unique and special look to images. Now, on the more technical side of things, there's almost no distortion, a tiny bit of pin cushion distortion, a -2 to correct. Vignette's a little bit heavier. I needed to use almost 3 stops of correction to correct for that vignette, but as mentioned, there may be situations where you don't want to correct it because it is part of the overall look. There's definitely some color fringing at large apertures here. Particularly, I found that in high contrast kind of areas where light was leaking through, say, leaves in the shot. It'll definitely show up in some scenes. It's not terrible, but it's certainly present. Lateral chromatic aberrations by contrast are basically perfect. There are none of those to be seen. Now at f1, there is a useful amount of sharpness, but it is not like a Sigma lens where it's perfectly corrected, for example, at a large maximum aperture. What you have here is, as mentioned, a little bit of blooming on the textures and a little bit of fringing that gives a particular look. Now, in low contrast scenes, I find that there's enough sharpness to look great to me. And actually, I find underexposing a little bit is kind of a pro tip, helps to give a better look to images. And so as you can see here, there's a reasonable sharpness, but not high contrast across the frame. If you stop it down to f1.4, it is a little bit sharper and contrast is a little bit higher, but contrast gets much higher by f2. Though I will note that if you're shooting, as I did in testing, on an actual tripod and just shifting apertures, you may need to watch for a little bit of focus shift between f1 and particularly f1.4 to f2, I would say. I did need to refocus a little bit to get optimum results there. Now, in real-world shooting, if you're not just changing apertures in between shots, probably not an issue. You know, you set the aperture you want to shoot at, you focus at that, no problem there. By f2.8, you have basically perfect sharpness all across the frame. Landscape images are flawless. Lots of detail, lots of contrast, beautiful color. They're a joy. Diffraction will start to set in after f8 on a high-resolution body like my A7R Mark V. By f11, you will notice that it's softer than f8. By f16, it will be softer still. Now, the bokeh is really gorgeous. It has the ability to really isolate a subject. For example, I shot this shot of a budding apple shooting through branches and leaves beyond, and it just kind of creates this range of textures around that single object of focus. You can get a very, very great subject isolation for a lot of different types of shots. The bokeh is also very soft even when stopped down. The shot at f2, you can see that though you can see more of the background, everything is still really softly rendered. I also found that there's really good 3D pop. This image, for example, it seems like the petals that are reaching towards the frame just kind of pop right off of the frame itself. As noted previously, specular highlights are not going to be perfectly round when the lens is stopped down a bit. Also worth noting is this lens, of course, is very good in dim light. It's, we know, one of their Nokton lenses, so that bright aperture means that you can manually focus, you can get lots of information in the viewfinder, and I shot into the deep recesses of my lens cabinet and shooting at very, very dim conditions at f1. I was able to get this shot, no problem, still very nice and clean. I was surprised to find that flare resistance was really not too bad for such a huge aperture at f1. I actually saw probably more things when stopped down a bit, but I would say overall that is not terrible. I don't know that I would go around just shooting into the sun all the time, but for a huge maximum aperture lens, this is definitely better than average for that. So my conclusion is this: if you like manual focus lenses, then Voigtlander lenses with Zeiss kind of out of the game are pretty much top of the heap at this point. And in most cases, they're much more inexpensive than what an equivalent Zeiss lens would be, and they tend to be a little bit smaller as well. So particularly if you're kind of a purist that liked classic Zeiss lenses, Voigtlander is really kind of nailing that demographic at this point. Now, maximum aperture of f1 makes for a more extreme lens. So you're going to pay for that, but the lens also produces gorgeous images, and it has that dual nature that gives you some options on the kind of looks that you can create. So it's not for everyone at a price tag of $1,900. But if you want something extreme, but also something different, if you're one of those people that say, I don't want my images to look like everyone else's, this is a lens that is worth considering. I'm not sure that it's worth it for everyone because of the price tag, but certainly for some people, I think that this is going to hit a really sweet spot of being something unique and special in terms of the images that it can produce. Now, if you want more information, you can check out either my full text review that is linked in the description down below, or you can stick around and we're going to dive into the optical deep dive together.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see, distortion is so minimal. There's that tiny bit of pincushion distortion right there. Probably not worth correcting in most situations. However, here's what it looks like corrected along with that vignette correction. This is a plus 74 to eliminate that vignette from the corners. Now, you may not always want to correct that vignette because it is part of the look. You can see by f1.4 how much brighter the image looks. But if I'm looking at the images just in terms of my instinctive response, I actually like the image that has more vignette in it. It just helps to draw the eye to the subject. It just is more attractive to me. Let me give you another example. So once again here, technically at f2, this is the better image, obviously. It's brighter along the edges. But again, as I'm just looking at the image in general here at f1, the vignette is there, obviously, heavy in the corners, but it kind of draws your eye into the scene. And so it is part of the overall look, and so maybe just something to be aware of. Now, as you can see here, there is some fringing before and after the plane of focus, not extreme, but certainly present. And at large apertures like f1, you will see that fringing, particularly in some high contrast situations. And so here you can see there's spots where the light's coming through that we're getting some fringing here and just along these edges. So that's the places where I see it the most. In a shot like this, I'm not really seeing a lot of fringing. I'm more just seeing kind of that dreamy look. You can see that there's just a little bit of blooming along the edges that just gives kind of a little bit of a haze to it that is part of the overall look, and either you like that or you don't like it. Now, I will say that in certain situations that are a little bit lower contrast, like in this shot, this is also at f1, but while there is a little bit of that glow effect on there, I actually think that there's plenty of detail and contrast for this shot. And obviously, then I have a really strong natural kind of framing because of the defocus here. And so you put it in the right situation, and fringing and contrast is actually fine. It's just in other situations, things will look lower contrast. Now, if you stop down and look for lateral chromatic aberration, where it typically shows up near the edge of the frame, here nothing is corrected, but you can see it's perfect. Black and white transitions are just what you're looking for. Now, in some ways, it feels unfair to test an f1 lens at 61 megapixels, but that's what we do around here, and we show it at 200% magnification. So doing this torture test, we see that really sharpness and detail isn't too bad. The information is there. There's a little bit of fringing, as you can see here. And again, there's a little bit of that bloom on the textures. And so it isn't top notch in terms of contrast. But here in the mid frame, same thing. You can see that there is detail there. It's just contrast isn't super good. Looking down here into the corner, I actually think that there's a pretty decent amount of detail and contrast here in the corners. I'm actually surprised by how good it is. I also see that blooming here and a lack of contrast that, as you can see, makes this look quite washed out, where even on the left side you can see how much darker that it looks. I showed this image briefly earlier in a very, very dimly lit situation. And this is at f1, and you can see that, again, there's a little bit of bloom on those textures, but certainly completely usable. And if you look at it as a whole, everything actually has a decent amount of pop to it. Another shot here, shot at f1, and looking at the global contrast, there's nothing to dislike here. The look of the image is actually great, and it's only when looking at a pixel level that you can see that maybe there isn't as much contrast as what you might like, but again, it's part of the wide open look of this lens. Now, if you compare f1 and f1.4, we can see in the middle of the frame, contrast has improved a little bit, and you can see there's just a little bit less haze on the textures. Mid-frame, again, it just kind of looks brighter in general. It's not like there's a lot of additional detail, but contrast has improved. The corners are probably the most obviously improved, and a lot of that has to do with some natural increase of contrast here, vignette lift. We can see, for example, here that the contrast between the black and the white sections near the edge of the chart, much more pronounced there. Now, the big jump here in terms of contrast comes between f1.4 and f2. So in the center of the frame, you can see it's just a radically different result. Now we're talking about an ultra-sharp, high-contrast lens at f2. That's true with some significant improvement in the mid-frame. And then the corners look like the center in terms of they're really, really much sharper. If anything, actually, I think that there is a bump right towards the edge of the frame, which looks fantastic. And if anything, I would say that this zone comparatively doesn't look quite as good. And so I haven't seen an MTF chart, but I suspect what you would see is a bit of a dip about 10% away from the edge of the frame and then a rise back up towards that last few percentage points. So our significant jump was from f1.4 to f2, but from f2 to f2.8, you can see continually improved contrast. Detail is looking good at various places in the frame itself. We're getting a nice consistent result. These corners in particular are really, really impressive, but also kind of our mid-frame results are looking good as well, but corners actually comparatively looking better than the mid-frame. You can expect to see your optimal result across the frame at f5.6. By f8, it still looks almost as good, but not quite as good. The corners look really excellent at both apertures. I mean, it just looks great everywhere. So that means that when you're shooting landscapes, even at high resolution, you're just going to see beautiful detail throughout the frame, and of course, great colors that are kind of the hallmark of this type of lens from Voigtlander. Again, everything looks, look at that boat there, just the fine detail, and outside of this little shack, all of those fine details just look great. So by f11, diffraction is going to soften the image a bit more, and then by the time you get to f16, definitely softer still, though certainly not to an unusable level. It still looks pretty decent in my opinion. Now, the real advantage here with this huge maximum aperture is your ability to do creative things with depth of field. So in this case, as mentioned, this is a shot of a budding apple that I shot through various branches and leaves, which create this kind of natural frame around it. You can see them very highly defocused, and then you go towards the background, beautifully defocused, which gives you a unique image in between on the subject. Here you can see that's tiny little plane of focus there, and then everything else is defocused. This shot here, again, everything is nicely blurred out, and you can see that if we zoom into the actual subject here, you can see again there's just a little bit of that kind of glow along the textures, but there's a very useful amount of information there, and of course the image as a whole looks great. This image, also another one I mentioned because of the three-dimensional pop, and you can see that that shallow depth of field allows your subject to really stand out. Bokeh remains nice as you stop down. Of course, at f2, we already noted that contrast and detail has jumped up to where it's just epically sharp, as you can see here. But then you can still see that the background, though it's not as blurred away, it's still very nice and soft. Now, when it comes to flare, a f1 lens is pretty hard to test wide open just because it lets in so much light. And so in this case, you can really just kind of see more of a blown out area. But I was actually fairly impressed by how little ghosting there was. And then if you stop down, I saw a few little ghosting artifacts this is actually at f11, nothing much to see, and you can see the contrast is excellent. And so that's really pretty impressive for such a large aperture lens.
So thanks for sticking around till the end. I hope that the deeper dive into the optics gave you some answers to some questions that you still may have had in your mind. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.